If you have access to a Bible today, I invite you to turn with me to the First Testament book of Esther. We're in chapter 7. By way of review, the Persian king Xerxes, who the Bible calls Ahasuerus, had issued a decree that legalized the killing and looting of Jewish families on one day. The passing of this decree was maneuvered by one of Xerxes' chief advisors, a man named Haman. Xerxes did not, however, realize that his newlywed queen Esther was in fact of Jewish ancestry. To this point in Esther's story, she's begun to set the stage for revealing her ethnicity to Xerxes and for asking for mercy for her people, but she has not done either of these things yet. That brings us up to the events of chapter 7, and we're going to do a lot of reading in the next few moments. In fact, I'm going to read all of chapter 7, all of chapter 8, and about half of chapter 9. Esther chapter 7, beginning in verse 1. So the king and Haman went in to feast with Queen Esther. On the second day, as they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I've won your favor, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me. That is my petition, and the lives of my people. That is my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have held my peace. But no enemy can compensate for this damage to the king." Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he? Who has presumed to do this?" Esther said, "A foe and enemy, this wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. The king rose from the feast in wrath and went into the palace garden, but Haman stayed to beg his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that the king had determined to destroy him. When the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman had thrown himself on the couch where Esther was reclining, and the king said, "Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house?" As the words left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, "Look, the very gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, stands at Haman's house, 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Hang him on that." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the anger of the king abated. On that day King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. Then the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. So Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet, weeping and pleading with him to avert the evil design of Haman the Agagite, and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. The king held out the golden scepter to Esther, and Esther rose and stood before the king. She said, "If it pleases the king, and if I have won his favor, and if the thing seems right before the king, and I have his approval, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote giving orders to destroy the Jews who are in all the provinces of the king. For how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming on my people? Or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred?" Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to the Jew Mordecai, "See, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he plotted to lay hands on the Jews. You may write as you please with regard to the Jews in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring, for an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked." The king's secretaries were summoned at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day, and an edict was written according to all that Mordecai commanded, to the Jews and to the satraps and the governors and the officials of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to every province in its own script and to every people in its own language, and also to the Jews in their script and their language. He wrote letters in the name of King Ahasuerus, sealed them with the king's ring, and sent them by mounted couriers riding on fast steeds bred from the royal herd. By these letters the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to assemble and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, with their children and women, and to plunder their goods, on a single day throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. A copy of the writ was to be issued as a decree in every province and published to all peoples, and the Jews were to be ready on that day to take revenge on their enemies. So the couriers, mounted on their swift royal steeds, hurried out, urged by the king's command. The decree was issued in the citadel of Susa. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king, wearing royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown and a mantle of fine linen and purple, while the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. For the Jews there was light and gladness, joy and honor. In every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict came, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a festival and a holiday. Furthermore, many of the peoples of the country professed to be Jews, because the fear of the Jews had fallen upon them. Now in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, when the king's command and edict were about to be executed, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain power over them, but which had been changed to a day when the Jews would gain power over their foes, the Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who had sought their ruin, and no one could withstand them, because the fear of them had fallen upon all peoples. All the officials of the provinces, the satraps and the governors and the royal officials were supporting the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai had fallen upon them. For Mordecai was powerful in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces as the man Mordecai grew more and more powerful. So the Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, slaughtering and destroying them, and did as they pleased to those who hated them. In the citadel of Susa the Jews killed and destroyed 500 people. They killed Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Paratha, Adalia, Aridata, Parmashta, Arisai, Aridai, Vaisatha, the 10 sons of Haman, son of Hamadatha, the enemy of the Jews, but they did not touch the plunder. That very day the number of those killed in the citadel of Susa was reported to the king. The king said to Queen Esther, "In the citadel of Susa the Jews have killed 500 people, and also the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It shall be granted you. And what further is your request? It shall be fulfilled." Esther said, "If it pleases the king, let the Jews who are in Susa be allowed tomorrow also to do according to this day's edict, and let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows." So the king commanded this to be done. A decree was issued in Susa, and the 10 sons of Haman were hanged. The Jews who were in Susa gathered also on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they killed 300 persons in Susa, but they did not touch the plunder. Now the other Jews who were in the king's provinces also gathered to defend their lives, and gained relief from their enemies, and killed 75,000 of those who hated them, but they laid no hands on the plunder. This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested, and made that a day of feasting and gladness. Permit me a few moments to explain what I think is going on in these chapters of Esther, and to do that, I have to bring us back to the story of King Saul. I'm going to summarize most of what we find in Saul's story, but for reference, I welcome you to turn to 1 Samuel chapter 15. King Saul was Israel's first official king, and his reign was a bit bumpy. Nevertheless, Saul enjoyed some measure of success against Israel's enemies, and in 1 Samuel chapter 15 the prophet Samuel came to Saul on behalf of God and instructed him to go to war with the nation of Amalek. God's reason for the attack, according to Samuel, was rooted in several assaults waged against the Israelites by the Amalekites some 400 years prior. Samuel instructed Saul to destroy the Amalekites along with everything that belonged to them, keeping no plunder whatsoever for Israel. Saul obeyed initially, attacked the Amalekites, defeated them, and destroyed most of what God had commanded through Samuel. However, Saul spared the king of the Amalekites, along with his family most likely, whose name was Agag. And he kept alive the best of their livestock. These acts of disobedience eventually cost Saul the kingship of Israel, making way for God's selection of David. Now, we've observed earlier in this sermon series some of the ways in which Saul's story has borne fruit in the book of Esther. Saul and Mordecai were from the same tribe, Benjamin, and they were even from the same family in that tribe, the family of Kish. Haman, Mordecai's adversary, was a descendant of the Amalekite king Agag, or probably Agag. And in 1 Samuel, King Saul was ordered to wipe out the Amalekites, whereas in Esther, an Amalekite was conspiring to wipe out Saul's people, the Jews. What I believe was going on in the chapters of Esther that we've just read is an assumption on the part of Mordecai and Esther, and by extension all of the Jewish people in Persia, that the command of God to King Saul was still in effect and required fulfillment. In other words, these events in Esther would never have occurred at all if Saul had done as he was commanded in 1 Samuel chapter 15. But Saul had disobeyed, and so later in the context of Persia, the Jewish people were facing possible annihilation by a descendant of the king that Saul had disobediently spared. When history repeated itself, and the Amalekites again tried to assault Israel, Mordecai and Esther took up the responsibility to finish the task God had given to King Saul. How do I know that's what they thought they were doing? Well, I don't for sure, but I suspect as much because of some of the details of the text. The reminder that Haman was a descendant of Agag in chapter 8, verse 3. The execution of Haman's family in chapter 9, verse 7. The references to the elimination of all those who sought to harm the Jews, and the insistence that the Jews did not lay their hands on the plunder in chapter 9, verse 10 and verse 15, all seem to recall the commands God had originally given to King Saul. In some ways, it seems to me that Mordecai and Esther saw themselves as completing the task assigned to their fallen ancestor. And I suspect this is part of why they asked for an additional day to vanquish their enemies, and why they celebrated as they did. I'm sure they were overjoyed to be rid of those who might plot to do them harm, at least temporarily. But I'm inclined to believe that they saw these events as an opportunity to redeem the line of Saul by proving to be more faithful to God than their ancestor had been. So that's what I think these chapters are about, but all that doesn't really get us where I think we need to go today. The deeper and more challenging question for us is this: were they right? Is this what God wanted? Was the command given to King Saul still in need of fulfillment? Did God want this to happen? I think the prophets of Israel were inclined to that assumption, but the history of Israel shows us that they weren't sure. When the book of Esther was translated into Greek, which was the translation used by most of the writers of the New Testament, 106 verses were added to Esther, and those 106 verses profoundly affect the story. Even more, there was a debate among the Jewish rabbis some 200 years after Jesus about whether Esther was to be treated with the same respect as the other books of what we call the Old or the First Testament. To add to the difficulty of Esther, the book is never once quoted in the New Testament, and no extant writings of the earliest Christian leaders for the first 400 years of the Christian Church ever once referenced the story of Esther. Additionally, the Jewish festival that commemorates the events of Esther, the festival of Purim, is one of the only festivals that the New Testament does not record Jesus as having observed himself, and one of the central features of Purim, drunkenness, is condemned as a sin by the writers of the New Testament. So what are we to do with Esther? I think part of the challenge of Esther's story is that it helps us to see that people can be both right and wrong at the same time in how they interpret the will of God. To a certain degree, we can see how Mordecai and Esther might have felt that their violent retribution against those who would do them harm was honorable in God's eyes. After all, God had commanded one of their ancestors to destroy these very same people, and he had been punished for disobeying God's command. How could obeying God's command, albeit centuries later, be wrong? Even more, God seems to have been at work behind the scenes assisting Mordecai and Esther, so doesn't that also imply that what they did was what God wanted them to do? I think the answer to that question is not necessarily. In the context of King Saul, he received a direct command from God through a known and recognized prophet in the person of Samuel. Mordecai and Esther did not receive those communications. Now, God was clearly working to provide Mordecai and Esther opportunity to circumvent Haman's plot, but when the moment arrived and Xerxes gave them permission to write an edict that offset Haman's, Mordecai wrote of his own accord. We see this in chapter 8, verses 8 through 10. Instead of writing a new edict, Mordecai simply amended Haman's edict, virtually ordering Jews to do to their enemies what their enemies wished to do to them. Now, the law of Moses did require an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, so Mordecai was well within the law of Moses to do this. But God in the story did not tell him to do it, and he certainly didn't have to do it. I've often wondered why Mordecai and Esther didn't fast and pray for guidance from God about what kind of edict to write, but they did not. I guess what I'm saying is that I believe that Mordecai and Esther believed they were doing God's will, and so their intentions were meritorious. However, because God never spoke in Esther, they were guessing. And I believe that the larger context of Christian scripture teaches that apart from a specific command of God, God's people should always work to be as gracious and merciful as possible. In fact, I think that this is partially what Jesus was trying to commend to his followers in Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 to 47, when he said, "You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. You've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same?" I believe Mordecai and Esther, given the time in which they lived and the information they had, acted as rightly as they could imagine. And so I'm persuaded that Jewish tradition had every reason to celebrate what they did, until, that is, the coming of Jesus. I suspect that this holiday receives such antagonistic treatment in the New Testament because despite the purity of Mordecai and Esther's intentions, Jesus has revealed the foulness of their behavior. Of course, to be fair to Mordecai and Esther, they did not have a lot of time to consider their response. Sometimes we're forced to act quicker than wisdom would require. However, to question the rightness of Esther's and Mordecai's decision to ask for a second day to vanquish their enemies is not necessarily to dismiss the premise that sometimes even Christians might justify the use of force. That's a different question, and one that has proven difficult to settle throughout the history both of the nation of Israel and of the Christian church. We recall, of course, that Jesus confessed to Pilate that his kingdom is not of this world. Consequently, I'm of the opinion that Christianity should not attempt to become an earthly kingdom, nor should we align ourselves with a kingdom of the earth. Having confessed that, however, I also don't see the scriptures as advising that Christians simply retreat from culture and refuse to participate in any role in the kingdoms of the earth. The challenge of Christian participation in the kingdoms of the earth remains difficult to discern because as followers of Jesus, we're not called either to love our enemies or to care for the weak and the vulnerable. We're called to do both of these things. So whatever our solution, it must be considerate of both calls of the kingdom. Perhaps the decision was simpler for Mordecai and Esther. They lived before the coming of Jesus, they lived under the law of Moses, and they lived in a season in which God was not speaking through prophets. But the question of how a follower of Jesus is to respond to oppressive regimes and systemic injustice is quite complicated for us, as it should be. We'll be judged by God, both with respect to our love of our enemies and with respect to our care for the helpless. This is one of the spaces that Christians inhabit. Life sometimes presents us with situations in which there is no right decision. We've already been reminded earlier in this series that sin oftentimes creates moral ambiguity. But there is always a right way to make a decision. The right way for a Christian to make a decision is to listen to Jesus. So in conclusion, let's hear his words again today. First in Matthew chapter 5, 38 to 47, which we've just read. And then in Matthew 23, verses 1 through 4. Matthew 5, verse 38 to begin. You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. You've heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? And now Matthew 23, verses 1 through 4. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Therefore do whatever they teach you and follow it. But do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they teach. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on the shoulders of others, but they themselves are unwilling to lift a finger to move them. If we were ever to find ourselves in a situation similar to that in which Esther and Mordecai found themselves, our response as followers of Jesus must be informed both by Jesus' positive assertions of the ethics of the kingdom, like we see in Matthew 5, and of his criticism of the leaders of his people in his day, who put burdens on the people but did not help them, that we see, for instance, in Matthew 23. May the Lord add his blessing to our wrestling with his word. Amen.